everyone. Okay, so we're good to go, aren't we, by the look of things? So that's great. So thank you once again for the invitation to talk. This is the title of my talk, as you probably know. Islands of Stone, Neolithic Crannogs in the Outer Hebrides. And so I'm Duncan Garrow, but this is very much a collaborative team project with Fraser, Angela, and Steph, who you can see down on the bottom of the screen there. It just happens to be me talking tonight. Thank you for letting me do that. And I'm sure that almost all of you have a good idea what a crannog is. But it's best not to be too assumptive on everyone's behalf. So, and it's also helpful, as you'll see, to think about the official definition of a crannog. Whilst many of you might well have a good idea, the real statement on what a crannog is from Canmore there is that it's an island, partly or wholly artificial, formed by dumping timber, earth, and stones, built in a loch, wetland, or estuary, and dating from prehistory to medieval. And that is the reconstructed Crannog on Loch that I'm sure many of you have been to, and has very sadly, since that photo was taken, not by me, burnt down. Crannogs have figured for a long time, since the earliest days, really, of archaeology, in archaeological writings and interest, and particularly so, obviously, in Scotland. So here's Munro's plan of the Loch of the Clans, which was actually identified in 1863, as you can see down the bottom there. And this, this is the very earliest days of kind of formal archaeology happening anywhere in Britain. Crannogs are, oh, sorry, I'm not meaning to skip that. I was just trying to hide the thing. Maybe I can hide it. Sorry, everyone, give me a second. No, I can still see the bar. Maybe, okay, that's better. I'll move it down the bottom. Sorry while I'm rambling on. So this is the distribution of archaeological islands. I'll come to exactly what I mean by that, but incorporating mostly crannogs in Scotland. They exist, as I'm sure many of you know, in Ireland as well. So 582 recorded, 197 of which are in the Outer Hebrides. And sorry, I'm having trouble. And going back to that Canmore definition and just focusing on the end point of that statement for a second, I just wanted to bring out the kind of vagueness of the dating from prehistory, which could extend back indefinitely, to the medieval period, and you might also add post-medieval, in all honesty, as well. And that isn't just Canmore being vague. It's a reflection of reality. So there's a bar chart of Graham Cavers's data. I'll show our own data a bit later, which is similar. But just giving a sense of the spread of Crannog dates. So you can see 800, 200 being Iron Age, essentially, right up through the different periods on towards the right-hand side of the graph. And in Graham Cavers's data, which is why I've left this graph up there, from 2010, the left-hand column, the pre-800 BC one, was that little tiny blue bar. And the green ones is the ones that we've added subsequently through our own work, again, which I'll be telling you about in a minute. Another issue, I told you I'd come back to this in a second, is that definition of a crannog. And I'm not going to get into that thorny subject in any depth, because it's a difficult one. But in a recent paper, and the paper came out of our work on the database, which I'm shortly going to tell you about as well. We realized that these were actually very difficult things to pin down and define. So this is a diagram taken from that paper, and our definition of an archaeological island is that grey dashed line that you can see on the screen. But you can also see that you have entirely artificial islands on the right-hand side of the Venn diagram, natural islands on the left-hand side of the diagram, and then you have what I've called structurally augmented islands in the middle. And those artificial islands are obviously humanly made sites, but also that grey line around the archaeological island line incorporates things that are happening on entirely natural islands that haven't been structurally augmented, which we think are interesting archaeologically as well. And if you take that more holistic definition and of this thing we've called the archaeological island, you can then drill down into the different categories if you want to, of whether or not they're artificial. So to go back to that left-hand bit of the bar chart and the pre-800 BC Neolithic Crannogs, the first known Neolithic Crannog, so artificially created island, was Island Dommel in North Uist. And that site was discovered by Ian Armitt and his team in the 1980s. And Ian went to dig that site because he thought it was an Iron Age Crannog, and the general assumption previously had pretty much always been that Crannogs were going to be Iron Age or later, and he thought this was an Iron Age one. There was a settlement on the nearby shore, and he wanted to look at the relationship between the island settlement and the shoreline contemporary settlement, that he thought. But very soon, right at the beginning, really at the top of the excavation, they encountered buildings, as you can see in the site plan on the right-hand side there. And they also encountered a large amount of Neolithic pottery. And Ian knew enough about his archaeology to recognise that these were not Iron Age pots. And they soon recognised that they actually had a Neolithic crannog, the first real one found, on their hands. And so they dug for several seasons over the course of the late 80s. And there you can see some lovely Neolithic pots, photos taken by Mike Hopper, who's worked a lot with us. He digs with us, and he also, thankfully for us, writes up the pottery in a very expert manner because his PhD was on the pottery from Island Dommel. And there you can see Alan Braby's reconstruction and the kind of complicated phasing that they identified, having dug through for several seasons through the site. So they found that site, and subsequently lots of people were obviously very interested that there was a Neolithic crannog on their hands, and they were subsequently, lots of people said, in light of the site, maybe there'll be more found, basically, which is what these various quotes. So don't worry about reading them all or anything like that. It's just to point out that people were wondering whether there'd be more because the first one had been found. And none were found. Not loads of effort, but some effort was expending on trying to find them until Chris Murray, who lives in Stornoway, and subsequently with his friend Mark Elliott, did fieldwork of their own. And Chris is not, and I would definitely not say he's an archaeologist with a capital A even today, but he was once a Royal Navy diver, and he was able to do scuba diving, but he was also very good at fingertip searches. And I also think Chris is one of those people that finds things, which is always a handy trait to have. So Chris was walking his dog, and he thought that he'd have a look at around a crannog and see what he found. And what he found was some spectacular Neolithic pottery. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this brilliant photo that Chris took of kind of the Neolithic pot equivalent of Excalibur coming out of the Loch. And that is an Unstone bowl. So a very clearly diagnostic early Neolithic form, and the bottom right you can see lots of the other material that Chris and Mark found. Subsequently, Chris and Mark, because they had luck in that first site, they literally went onto Google Earth and looked for other comparable little islets that they could have a look at. And so that's so we got involved first of all through Alison Sheridan at the National Museum of Scotland, and we were dating some of this material that Chris and Mark had recovered. And that was our first involvement on a previous project, the reason why we were digging in South Uist in 2012. So Chris and Mark looked at all of those sites on the map, all of them in Lewis, as you can see. And so they looked at the black ones as well, but the red ones are the ones that produce Neolithic pottery. So they accumulated a collection of about 5 different, well, not about 5, of 5 sites with lots of material, some of them with 40 or 50 vessels represented. And so we were interested in the Hebridean Neolithic. We were also interested because Fraser, who you saw a picture of earlier, is able to dive and has done some underwater archaeology in his time. Although he tends nowadays to work on land apart from this project. So because Fraser could dive and we wanted to find out more about these intriguing sites, we put together a grant application and did a small pilot project in 2016 and 17 focusing on those 3 sites. And I'll show you, so there's Loch, a lovely drone photo showing you it's the kind of site it is, and we'll just fly in on the drone, so to speak, so that you can have a bit more of a detailed look at the site, and you're getting a sense of that landscape that it's like now. And there you can see, hopefully you can see Chris gesticulating and moving. He doesn't always move that fast, it's just the video speeded up. And I'm sure you can see the divers in the water, so they're recovering further material, inspecting the site and the kind of thing that they found. So there's Felix and Bob coming up with really, as you can see, almost as impressive as Chris's Excalibur pot, some fantastic more Hebridean Neolithic pottery, basically. And that's just one example of several of that kind of size, and then lots that were not as big but still really very impressive. So as a result of that work, Arnish, we couldn't, there was no visibility, so we focused on Borgestell and Langevat more. So these are the 2 sites that we looked at in that pilot phase. The red dots indicate pottery, so you can see there's pottery in the loch all around both of the sites in quite substantial numbers. And the blue dashed lines, as you might be able to guess, are is the current loch level when we were doing that survey work. And what's been done here is that these models are derived from photogrammetry, and they're ultimately derived from photos that were taken underwater as well as overland, and then the 2 different things have been stitched together to give us an overall view of what the sites look like, that you couldn't get otherwise, because obviously the loch is up to the blue dashed line. Back in 2017, we also undertook a small excavation at Langevat, and there you can see the trench. We found a structure that likely dates to the Bronze Age, and we also found some Neolithic pottery on the surface of the islet as well as around the edge, but no clear evidence of Neolithic buildings in the manner that Ian Armitt had excavated at Island Dommel. So as a result of that work, we kind of highlighted the really quite small size that you can get a sense of there, about 15 meters across. Neither of the sites that we looked at in some detail, we didn't excavate Borgestell at that point, but we'd had a good look on the surface. This odd depositional practice into the water, so lots of pots being chucked into the loch around the islets. We had a sense that they were kind of creating this place, that there was this separation from normal life. Maybe they were kind of liminal spaces. The monument, the architecture could definitely be described as monumental. And that really struck you as these sites, once you've seen them and dived around them and looked at them in detail, it really seemed monumental and not dissimilar to some of the Neolithic tombs on the islands not that far away. There's a communal construction process involved in their construction. So it had been argued previously by Mike Copper, who I mentioned earlier, along with Ian Armitt, that they were maybe special sites created for feasting and things like that, and that's why they were chucking these pots off. And we were then, as a result of our work, able to get some radiocarbon dates from which all fall in a very narrow bracket from between about 3,500 to 3,300 Cal BC. So that was really good. We found out a lot of stuff as a result of that work. And it also helped us build a case to put in a more substantial grant application to the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So hence the pause in our fieldwork. And then, so we were due to do the first season of fieldwork in 2020, but then it was COVID, so that everything's been knocked along a year. So the project's ultimately run from 2020, and it's probably going to extend just about up to the beginning of 2025 in terms of our work on it. So this is the second site that we've looked at in detail in 2016-17 and much more recently as well, at Loch that's only about 3 kilometers away from Langevat that we were just looking at us having dug a trench across. So this project, the current project that we're gradually getting towards the end of now, very sadly, has had 4 main aspects, and I'll try and tell you about each of those in turn. So it involved desk-based research into all archaeological islands, field survey visits to over 100 Crannogs in North Uist, Benbeckler and South Uist. The point being that Chris and Mark had found lots in the north of the Outer Hebrides, and we wanted to have a look if they could be found more extensively than Island Domwell in the south. A diver survey following up on that, and then what we've called excavation of our showcase site at Borral that you can see in the photo there. So looking at the first desk-based research, and Steph Blankshine, who you saw at the beginning, who's the postdoc researcher on the project, she's been very much responsible, and we have her to thank for that part of this part in particular. We have many things to thank Steph for, but she has driven the database creation basically. So as you might imagine, we started with Canmore, the national record. We also obtained data from the regional historic environment as well. And we began with Canmore, just a couple of entries to you can see of a site in South Uist. Then what we also did was to augment that record, or to get deeper down into the archaeological history record of Crannogs. Steph also undertook an extensive data mining exercise of PSAS and Discovery and Excavation in Scotland, all volumes, which you can get digitally from the ADS. And because you can get them digitally, she was able to search the text for the terms that you can see up on the top of the screen there. So obviously Crannog and related parts of that word. And then that research took her to find these different other categories that people had used, but when they were ultimately meaning Crannog or archaeological island as we would define it now. So she searched digitally in that using NVivo software, and that led to over 4,000 references to these sites in 452 articles in 177 volumes covering 230 years. So a lot of references to Crannogs. As you might imagine, some of those references were just one mention in comparing a site that they were excavating to a Crannog. Others, however, were more informative, and what Steph did was she identified the articles that had, more than 1 or 2 mentions, and then drilled down into those and extracted information manually, so to speak. So she was reading it wasn't the machine reading it this time, to find out more information about those sites. That ultimately led, this is a short version of the process, but that ultimately led to the creation of that database of 582 sites, and you can just see a screenshot of information recorded about them, and that database hopefully is available on ADS, open access to everyone. It should it should be available, but for some reason it's held up at the ADS end, and we've been badgering them to make it available. But that should now, or very shortly, because it hasn't quite happened, be available for anyone to use. And you can see, hopefully, lots of important information about every single archaeological island. So where it is, obviously, but also what materials have been recovered, when it was excavated, when it was surveyed, if it was surveyed, that kind of thing. So hopefully that'll be immensely useful resource for people to use, and not least NOSAS, because I know that you've been working on of Crannogs, and hopefully this will contain some information that's useful to you in particular. But we can maybe talk about that at the end. So the kind of thing Steph was able to pull out of that information was that map that I showed you at the beginning. And then on the screen, you can see there a representation of when sites have been excavated and when they've been diver surveyed. And you can see on the right-hand image that real bias towards the red dots, which are mainly the result of the work that we and Chris have been doing recently, but obviously not solely that. People like Robert Lenford had dived on sites there before, and others. Steph was also able to kind of augment that bar chart that Graham Cavers that I showed you before, and establish the dates of all of those Crannogs where they're known. So this map is only the dated ones that we have any idea of the dates, and you can see the circle symbols are dated kind of reliably by radiocarbon dating or material culture. And then the square symbols are dated by architecture, and that's probably slightly less reliable. But we felt it was mistaken to miss that out of our dating map, because certainly you might be able to tell if there's, if there's a castle on it. You might assume that that was medieval, for example, and even if nothing had been excavated or radiocarbon dated on that site. So that's our bar charts from that data, and you get a sense of the different dates of different sites. So broadly speaking, similar to what that one of Graham Cavers, but as you can see, hopefully you can see the grey bars are the architectural dates. So quite a lot of them in some cases, especially in the Outer Hebrides, are contributing to that mapping. But obviously you can filter this from our database if you want to, if you feel the architecture is unreliable or whatever. And the other thing that you might have noticed already is that the graphs look broadly similar on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side they look dissimilar. And that is something that we've been thinking about along the whole of the project, and that we talked about most extensively in that paper that I mentioned, that you can see up the top right there. So that was published in Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society as open access, so anyone can get hold of it, even if they don't subscribe to PPS. And in that paper, we talked about the fieldwork we've been doing, but we also talked about the results of Steph's data mining and the qualitative results that it produced, and amongst which were a number of sites, I think it's 11 in total, which had produced, so these are not thought to be Neolithic Crannogs, but they have produced what look like Neolithic lithics. So all the way from stone axes, you can see on the right-hand side, obviously, which could potentially have been picked up by Iron Age people and brought to the site, possibly, through to scrapers and cores and things that you'd think Iron Age people were less likely to pick up. So in that paper, we talk about whether this could be a glimpse of Neolithic activity on mainland Scottish Crannogs as well, and we leave that open to being answered, if you like. But it was definitely a hint that that's possible. And in saying that, one of the important things to point out is that lots of those crannogs that have been excavated have not been excavated down to the lower layers because it's where it gets wet. So lots of crannogs have been dug, but they haven't been dug down to the bottom. So if there were Neolithic phases, they might not have been excavated, even if the crannog itself has been excavated. And that leads me to mention, we didn't mention it in the paper in the end, Lou Matthews, PhD. I'm sure that some of you will know her work, and maybe even her. And so she, it was in the news quite a lot because of the publication of, I can't remember the name of it, Archaeology Scotland magazine, maybe. Sorry, I should know the name. But Lou was coring Iron Age sites, and she got a very interesting spike of activity around about 3000 BC on Loch, which interestingly, to my mind, is the one in the red ring. For those of you who don't know it in reality, I'm sure some of you do, right exactly opposite the Outer Hebrides, and it's a site that we're interested in having a bit more of a look at subsequently soon, hopefully. Moving on to phase 2, the field survey visits to 114 Crannogs. And this phase of work was to say the participation and collaboration with the US Community Archaeology Group was vital is a bit of an understatement. They basically did all this phase of the work for us, but obviously working with us. And there you can see Roger and David, Meg and Ruad, the dogs, doing some of the work on the project on our behalf. So what we did was we had that massive database, and then we obviously had loads of sites that were in the southern part of the Outer Hebrides that we were interested in, but we didn't really know the reliability of the record or what they were like and that kind of thing. So what David, Roger, and a number of other members of UCAG did was go out and look at those sites, take drone photos, see whether the islands were natural or not. At that point, we were looking for artificial ones only. They wrote report sheets for us, and were able to capture an enormous amount of information, which really, for the project, which was immensely helpful. So here you can see just some of the photos, the kind of report information that's produced, the annotated maps, that kind of thing. As a result of that, we were able to really augment the record immensely. So we've produced, in collaboration with all the people who did that work, the part 1 of the US Crannog survey report that's available online. We also hope that Canmore will be updated with photos that they took and the information that they gathered. So we want that information to feed back into the kind of the formal central record of those sites, because as you might imagine, some Crannogs are really well studied and well known, and many are not at all well known, and to the extent that in some cases they're not even real, even though they're down as Crannogs in the record. So that was an amazingly rewarding collaboration for us and got us to a brilliant position for part 3, which was diver survey, and that was essentially trying to replicate what Chris and Mark and subsequently we had done in Lewis, which was to dive as many sites as we could to see if we could recover Neolithic pottery as well. And obviously we couldn't have dived well over 100. So their work enabled us to focus in on the ones we thought, and I won't go into the detail, had the most potential to be Neolithic in origin. Essentially the ones that looked most like the ones we knew were Neolithic in Lewis. So in 2022, we went to visit those 30 sites in 25 lochs across the southern part of the island chain. We did look at Barrow in all of the phases. UCAG didn't survey the sites, but that was because really there weren't many with massive potential. One was now submerged, another had a building, a medieval building built on top of it, and those were the only two really essentially promising sites. So we focused on Uist and Benbecula. So those are the sites that we looked at. The blue ones are the ones that were in Canmore. The yellow ones are the ones that we identified through machine learning, so analysis of satellite imagery, basically to find new sites that weren't already in the existing record. And the pink ones are the ones that are the fantastic other scheduled sites that we went to visit, but were not dived in the way that we were looking for Neolithic pottery. So here's just a few photos of our work, and we had a fantastic time just basically putting on our dry suits, walking across the bog and jumping in the water, and in some cases finding brilliant things. So in all, 37 islets and 23 lochs were investigated, including the outliers. We looked with snorkel. We also did scuba where necessary, where it's too deep to have an effective survey just on a snorkel. We undertook aerial photogrammetry using a drone and also LiDAR surveys, so through which we were able to build up digital elevation models of the landscapes around the site. On some sites we did sonar, so that was looking at the loch bed. That image, that orangey image you can see in the middle is sonar image, and on one site we did some coring off the edge of the Crannog to try and get an understanding of the sequence off the edge of the Crannog and see if we could find any wood. So altogether, Steph's done this brilliant image of all of the sites that we looked at, and the dots you can see are the different materials recovered. And because there was a team of 5 or 6 of us, we spent a lot of time, and that was, I think one of the reasons for our success, which I'll come to in a minute, hinted at by those red dots there. A huge amount of time, because that's person hours. So it's when there were 5 of us for 1 hour, it counts as 5 hours. So we really were able to hit these sites hard, so to speak, and really give it a good job of looking. Sometimes there was nothing around them, as you can see on the empty ones, and sometimes we got material, iron-age pottery, as you would imagine, and various other things. But the main thing, the purpose of what we were doing was to find those red dots, the Neolithic pottery, which we did find on 3 new sites. So Island Dommel is up there on the top right. As you can see, the dots are on the islet because they were not our finds, they were Ian Armitt's team's finds. But you get what I'm saying. So the first site was Loch Nan Clachan in North Uist. So we got diagnostic pottery. We were able to date the residue on that pottery, and we also got wooden layers in that core that were dated to the Neolithic. So it looks like there's probably some wooden architecture off the edge of that site as well, which I'll come to in a minute. And on our site it'll be more relevant. Kildonan, we got quite a lot of Neolithic pottery. For those of you that know the islands, that's you can see it out of the window of the Kildonan Museum, and everyone's known about that site obviously for a long time, but no one's ever realized that there might be Neolithic pottery around it. So that was very exciting to find that stuff. There's also wooden fibre and or possible matting, that kind of thing. And finally, the mysterious Toberveg, which has that pot there next to the natural island on the top of the screen. It might be an augmented natural island, we're not sure. So we were actually looking at the islet on the bottom of that photo, which looks really nice, and we were really hopeful that might have Neolithic material. No such luck. There was Iron Age material, but nothing Neolithic, although it was quite silty. But on the way swimming back, Jack had a look at the natural-looking one and found that vessel, which we didn't initially recognise as Neolithic because it's undecorated, which is very unusual. But Mike subsequently has told us it's Neolithic. And it certainly, once he says that and you look at the form, you understand what he's talking about. So that was really exciting, the third site. So there is a map of all of the archaeological islands that have Neolithic material around them that we now know of, including Island Antia, which is definitely a natural island, but is a well-known Neolithic site excavated in the 50s by Scott. And so you can see what we've managed to do, which is really what we're hoping to achieve, is to extend that distribution down in the south, you know, a lot more widely across the Outer Hebrides as a whole, beyond just Island Dommel. So that was really it was a fun season of work, but it was also an immensely rewarding season of work. But as well as finding that Neolithic material, it's really fantastic to have got dating material. So we've been able to radiocarbon date some sites, we've produced pottery from some sites that no one had a clue what date they were, that kind of thing. So that's been fantastic in terms of understanding the wider Crannog record as well. So just turning to number 4 in my sequence, the excavation of our showcase site at Loch in the Isle of Lewis. So we're just going to whiz towards it on a drone now, just to give you that sense of the landscape. You probably caught a glimpse of our bell tents just as we whiz past. And there you get a sense of our excavations on top and the divers you'll be able to see in the water. And I'm sure you can see the pontoon, which was really helpful for keeping the generator on, which runs the divers' dredges, which is a noisy thing and nice to have away from us, not on the island while we're digging. Even out on that pontoon, it was quite nice when it switched off occasionally. So you can see, I'm sure you've caught glimpses in the photos I've shown you already, of the causeway running from the nearest bit of the shore out to the island. And as I'm sure you can see on that photo, it's submerged most of the time now. We haven't ever seen it when it's been properly out of the loch. And so this is we've excavated this site in 2021 and 2023. And you can see the concept, hopefully, in that image of excavating basically simultaneously the same trench, really, above water and below water. So that the rectangular grid that you can see under the water is the divers. It's like the grid allows them control, but it also allows them to lean on it while they're excavating. And the squiggly things on the left are the dredges that I was talking that were run off the generator. They're like hoovers that suck the sediment away as the divers are digging. For those of you that don't know the methods of underwater archaeology like me before this project. So these are some vertical drone photos of what we did. So that's the island from above. So we removed a lot of vegetation and exposed the stone structure. That was a lot of work doing that, but we got down to the stone layers and we had really found very, very little material culture at all. We'd found no pottery and we'd found about 2 possible quartz flakes, but that was it. And we were a bit puzzled about that. We were expecting to find more. Anyway, it got down to the kind of what you might call the base of the stone crannog, and we thought we'll have a look through that first layer. So you can see our sondage excavated through the stone. So we removed the stones, and in a way, we thought it was just going to be a big pile of stones, but actually, to our surprise, that wasn't the case. And you can see Jonathan last digging in that sondage, and maybe behind him you'll be able to see a kind of more organic looking layer. And this video and the photo up above give you a real sense of what it's like. It's really hard to photograph, but Jonathan troweling, you can get a sense of that dense, organic, twiggy, heathery layer that you can also see the thickness of in that photo up the top right. So what you had was a sequence of burnt material that I'll come to in a minute up the top there. And then you had a clay layer, and then you had essentially 2 layers of I can use the pointer. I'm sure you can see them really, but I'll do the pointer. So there's the burnt layers, clay, and then you've got a top layer of that organic materials is what we were looking at Jonathan digging there, and then you have a bottom layer that we've only dug in this little area because, as you can see, not only was it getting to the end of our excavation time, it was also getting very wet, and so that was very surprising to us, that we had these timber phases underneath the stone layer. Subsequently, we radiocarbon dated it, and we, even more surprisingly, basically demonstrated that the whole of the stone architecture up on top, at least above here, was post Bronze Age in date, and that meant that essentially there weren't the stones that we could see on top were probably not Neolithic. We remain unsure whether the kind of outer donut of stones was there in the Neolithic, because obviously stones on stones are quite hard to phase to different periods. That's the problem we face. Anyway, so when we came back in 2023, knowing that the timber layers were Neolithic, what we did was we dug this quadrant. So ignore this bit here, this trench here for now. So we dug this quadrant, and we were hoping to take these stones out and expose a much bigger area of that twiggy, woody phase, and see if we could see some wooden architecture, basically. As you'll be able to tell from that photo on the right-hand side and my slightly puzzled, disappointed-looking expression, that was the plan before it rained very heavily for a weekend. The entire landscape drained into the loch, and loch levels rose 45 centimeters, so miles above the level we'd had in 2021, and as you can see, into our quadrant trench, rather disappointingly for me. As you can see, Steph and Fraser in their dry suits up there, they weren't really bothered. They were fine whether it was deep or slightly deep or slightly shallow underwater. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we couldn't dig that quadrant, which was a bit disappointing. But what we did was go to the drier area up here and dig another longer kind of sondage-y trench through those layers. So in a way, a bigger version of what we've done in 2021. And that was really interesting in itself because near the upper layers, so at the same phase as those pinky burnt layers that I was showing you in the section, which is the 2021 and that's the 2023. So you've got this big burnt patch of probably peat ash slag, and here you've got this quite kist-like feature that I've got you a photo of there, which had flecks of burnt bone looking material in it. So we think that is probably a Bronze Age cremation burial that is actually, as you can hopefully see, underneath this slightly higher cairn. So quite possibly what they're doing in the Bronze Age is coming out to the island, possibly burying people under that cairn. So that makes sense of the stone architecture of the Bronze Age phase. Going down and down, past through that into the underlying timber layer. So now we're in the bottom one. That's Mike digging there. You can see it's beginning to get quite wet. We actually managed to get 65 centimeters below loch level before the water started coming in, because those organic layers were so kind of compact that they didn't let water in from the sides. So we got lots of pottery and stuff to date and that kind of thing from this, loads and loads of hazelnuts, but also hopefully you can see behind Mike there this wattling, which frustratingly we've only got this 1 meter width of, but you can see the wattling here, and then these upright stakes kind of holding it in place, and that was amazing to see. It's Neolithic in date. Fantastic bit of surviving wooden architecture, but slightly frustrating. We're not really sure what it is. Like, is it a revetment to keep the edge of the crannog at that point intact? Is it a building or some kind of structure? And we can't really tell from that relatively small section. So that kind of remains a mystery for us, annoyingly. So now I'm going to take you underwater. So that's just a drone shot from the side, just to remind you where we're at. So that was the 2021 trench that we were looking at with Jonathan in it, and the burnt areas are just here. And then we're going to go into this underwater trench just there. So down we go. And this is some nice diver footage of you can see that metal frame that I was talking about earlier, glinting in the sunshine. And I'm sure you can also make out an extensive layer of timbers. They basically seem to be laid timbers. They're not worked that we've seen yet, and they look like that. So that's extending out. So the edge of the stone crannog is up here. We've extended into it in this little trench extension there, and you can see the wood going off under there and ultimately towards where Mike was with that wattling in terms of levels, but also extending. So the edge of the stone crannog goes around there, and you can see the wooden layer extending right out there. So that was 2021. There's Steph's fantastic stitched together underwater photos and drone photos put together of the extensiveness of that wooden spread going right out there, and they did get the edge out here, as you'll see in a second. So we've got this funny kind of laid timber platform, if you like, extending right out into the edge, which you can see on Steph's plan there. And you might also be able to see that we've identified other timbers from diving. We haven't excavated them; they're just visible, going around there, which are also visible on this plot as those green shapes. And this is a drone photo taken on a really still day when you could see amazingly through the water. And there you can see what we think is probably in the kind of silts, the extent of the original wooden platform, because you've got the wood extending up to there, according to our trench dug this summer, and then you can very clearly see this kind of silty patch, and the outer timbers kind of maybe marking the edge, perhaps once holding it in. It's hard to know because we haven't excavated them, but also they're probably not directly in situ anymore. So that's been really amazing to find out. So I just wanted to finish the talk on a few kind of little asides, just a bit of a feature on the logistics, because it's an amazing site to work on, but it is quite logistically challenging. So you can see the nearest road in the middle of the image there. So when we first came in 2016 and 17, we were walking everything in and carrying the cylinders. But now we've got Hector and his amazing tracked machine there. He's bringing the pontoon out here. As you can see, we had to bring all the metal frames and the hoses and all sorts of stuff. So we had two bell tents, one to have tea in and shelter in for us, and this one was the shelter for all the equipment, of which there is a lot. And the other thing that's particularly painful for me to recall is that spoil arrow. So we couldn't keep the spoil on the island. It just wouldn't have become, you couldn't have managed it. So we did have to basically paddle the spoil off onto that part of the shore as the best landing place. So that involved kind of like ultimately filling up 21 1-ton bags of spoil, both years actually, and that was hard work, but very rewarding. But yeah, it gives you a bit of an idea of the challenges. In terms of the post-ex, so this is underway at the moment, as you'd imagine. And funnily enough, there've been a real flurry of emails today. So about the sedimentary DNA, and also about the plant remains and the wood from Anne Cronin, Jack Robertson at AOC, which they've done their report, so we'll be able to put in our latest round of radiocarbon dates. There's people working on the pollen. There's our colleagues in Bristol working on the lipids and the biomarkers in the pots. So that is led by Lucy Cramp, originally with Simon, and now with Dan, who's a PhD student that Lucy and I have jointly. And Dan is doing a lot of work on the lipids, so the fats that get incorporated into the pots. And what's particularly helpful for those guys about these sites is that because they're waterlogged, they preserve cereal biomarkers as well as the animal fats, basically. So the animal fats people have been able to do that for ages. But Lucy and Simon got a paper published in Nature Communications, a very high-profile journal, because they'd got the biomarkers. They found the evidence for cereals in the chemicals within the pots. And some of the work that they did, you can see in that kind of Venn diagram that Simon created. So they're beginning to have a look at what's actually been cooked in the pots and eaten. And you can see, broadly speaking, that carcass, so meat, and cereals are not used in the same vessels. Cereals and dairy are, and sometimes milk and meat are cooked in the same pots. So they're beginning to get at recipes. And when they published that paper, it was very comical because the press really picked up on the fact that they got a combination of cereal and dairy in these pots that were 5,000 years old. So the world's press got entertained by the oldest porridge being found in Scotland, kind of idea, which was funny for me because Lucy and Simon had to deal with all the responses. But that was a great bit of. It's nice for people to know about your work and to hear about the kind of things that we've been up to, and that our colleagues that we're working with on the scientific post-excavation analysis are able to demonstrate. We've also been working with the Ordnance Survey, so to develop a couple of apps or tours on their app, which is called Secret Stories. And so what we've done is develop, and one of the ideas was to help facilitate the increased engagement with the archaeology of the Outer Hebrides. So we created a tour of prehistory along the Hebridean Way, so covering right from the south of Barrow right up to the north of Lewis, and lots of sites that you could visit along the way if you're interested in some information, some accessible but reasonably detailed information about those sites, to try and help people find the brilliant archaeology of the Outer Hebrides and learn a bit more about it if they want to. We've also done one more immediately focused on Callanish, where obviously most people who see an archaeological site go to in Lewis, and so it's to let people find out about all the other stone circles as well as the main one that everyone visits in that Callanish landscape. That's the end, really. But I just wanted to let you know that the web address is quite easy to remember. So crannogs.soton.ac.uk, and there you can find more about the project, but also links to the reports if you're interested, to the data base once it's up, that kind of thing. So if you can find 3D models of the sites and things like that. Steph's done some cool kind of video tours of the Borgestell where I've been excavating mainly, so lots to check out there if you're interested. And I thought I'd end on the Sun's coverage of our work when we published the first paper about our initial work. So I've always appreciated their headline, "No Isle Deer." Quite a classic tabloid headline, describing us as puzzled archaeologists. We've proved that Scotland's mysterious man-made islands were built that long ago, but we still don't know why. And even though that was 2019, I'm not sure we could tell the Sun they were wrong in 2024 about whether or not we know why they did it. But we certainly know a lot more about what they got up to and what these sites were like. And obviously that's a very important first step in knowing what it was all about. So I'm sure you're going to ask me some awkward questions about what it was all about, but that's the end of the talk tonight. Please do ask me questions, and thank you very much for listening and for being here to hear about our work. Thank you very much.